Van and Aaron, I don't know if you know this, but there's been quite a lot of chatter about your talk within the advisory board. Katie said that you did some previous work with her as part of her Sandstar webcast and just could not stop gushing about your presentation. So no pressure, but the bar is pretty high. We're very excited to hear what you have to say. For those of you who are not familiar with RYUK, it is ransomware that has been infamous for targeting the healthcare sector during a global pandemic, which is pretty terrible. I think we can all agree. And it is absolutely something that we want to make sure that we are able to protect ourselves again as much as we can. And so thank you both for coming to present on this very, very important topic. And I will let you take it away.
All righty, thank you. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Spooky RYUKy Chapter 2, the sequel to our mild box office success, Spooky RYUKy 1, The Return of UNC 1878, which we had presented 3 days before Halloween on the Sandstar webcast. Today we'll be talking about UNC 1878, which until recently was one of our most popular UNCs. UNC 1878 is a prolific, financially motivated actor we've tracked since 2019, who primarily extorts victims through deployment of RYUK ransomware. Today's sequel will start with a quick recap of material covered in our first presentation, including exactly what the term UNC means when we refer to UNC 1878. And for all the diehard Spooky RYUKy fans, have no fear, because after our recap, we're diving straight into the new stuff. My name is Van Ta, and today I'm joined again by Aaron Stevens. We're both threat analysts on the Flare Advanced Practices team. Our team mission is simple: to know more about the adversary than anyone else and make that knowledge actionable to FireEye. And to deliver on this mission, we do three things. The first is we make key analytical decisions on what can be defined as an adversary versus a threat. We as a team and as individuals make these decisions day in and day out to know what are the groups and techniques that matter to our customers to determine where our focus should be. Second, we pursue these adversaries wherever they are within our ecosystem, whether the adversaries are hiding in our product telemetry or being uncovered in Mandiant incident response engagements or by managed defense. Our focus is surfacing impactful adversarial activity at our clients. And lastly, we institutionalize what we learn through our pursuit to make it actionable for FireEye. Now, that can manifest in a number of different tangible things, such as product detections, new malware family classifications, technical attribution in support of our responders, and the curation of our threat model. So I wanted to now briefly frame the data that fuels the content we'll be presenting today. So our team is in a unique position in the company where we can tap into a diverse set of organic data sources. The three primary data sources we leverage are our Mandiant consulting engagements, product telemetry, and our 24/7 managed defense team. Between these three sources, you can imagine we encounter a lot of adversaries. For example, over the past year, we've supported approximately 65% of event responses, which are nearing 1,000 between Mandiant consulting and managed defense. Now, what I find particularly neat about this is we're embedded with responders and supporting in real time as incident investigations unfold. Along with these three primary data sources, we also have a robust external collections apparatus that provides us ample data to corroborate our frontline observations. So one last piece of required reading before we really dive into UNC 1878 is to go over the concept of an UNC, what it is, what it's used for, and what we do with UNCs as a team and as a company. With regards to how we track threat groups, people may be more familiar with the FIN and APT designation, but as we're revealing more and more about UNC clusters, we felt this would be valuable to cover. If you recall our core mission and also the data sources that we collect against, whenever we find malicious activity, we often find a lot of it. And in order for us to effectively conduct investigations at scale, we need a way to meaningfully organize the malicious activity to define what it is we care about. To do so, we create UNCs, which is short for uncategorized, to cluster unique activity together and say that we've assessed this cluster of activity to be fundamentally part of the same intrusion set. So at a fundamental level, UNCs really are just labels for which you can bucket indicators and techniques into. This bucket then serves as a technical anchor for what we're saying is all related activity and becomes the foundation of our analysis and hunting, allowing us to then begin looking at what would otherwise be disparate intrusions. Let's use a real world analogy. Let's think of a singular incident at a client being a real life crime that's been committed, perhaps in a sleepy Midwest town. Now, there are a lot of crimes that happen all over the state and the country. So to investigate this particular crime, we need to label the evidence that we can prove is related to the crime committed. And to do so, our team would create an UNC. So at this crime scene, our initial UNC cluster may only consist of a partial fingerprint and maybe a foot impression, but by saying they're related, we could then apply this cluster against a larger corpus of crimes. Eventually, as we respond to more crimes and gather more evidence, we begin to unravel and assess what can be added to our initial UNC. As a result, we're learning more and more about a string of crimes, eventually being able to establish a profile and tradecraft. Now, UNCs in the world of computer crimes are really no different. Instead of traditional evidence like fingerprints and blood splatter patterns, we're dealing with IPs and hashes. Instead of evidence bags labeled triple homicide in Brainerd, Minnesota, we're labeling it UNC 1878. At any given time, Mandiant tracks over 1,500 UNC clusters. Over time, these UNCs that we create can grow, revealing ties to other clusters, which could lead to a merge of UNCs. Eventually, as we begin to have a strong grasp on an UNC's operation, UNCs can potentially graduate into APTs and FINs. So really, APTs and FINs are these big time criminals that were once born as an UNC long ago. Now I'm going to hand it over to Steve to begin our story on UNC 1878, which, unlike the movie Fargo, is a true story.
Gotta get my focus back. Okay, cool. Thanks, Van. Well, I hope you're all feeling a little more comfortable with UNCs now, because we're going to jump right into it with a quick rundown of UNC 1878. Those of you who saw Spooky RYUKy back in October may recognize this graphic, which I said was an overgeneralization of UNC 1878's MO. And it is, but it's also a good starting point to review their most common TTPs. Keep in mind, this is a crash course, and if you want a more in-depth overview, check out our Spooky RYUKy webcast, which is available on YouTube in its entirety. When we first began tracking UNC 1878 about a year ago, they were using initial access provided by TrickBot, conducting intrusion with everyone's favorite offensive security tool, Cobalt Strike Beacon, and eventually deploying RYUK. It's important to note that UNC 1878 only comprises the activity observed after initial access. Over the years, TrickBot and other botnets like it have served as a starting point for a wide range of financially motivated threat actors. The exact nature of the handoff is hard to determine with the data and visibility that we have access to, and for that reason, we like to keep them separate when it comes to attribution. After a few quiet months, we began to see RYUK in intrusions again, except this time beginning with KegTap, also known as Bazaar Loader, whose operators we track as UNC 2053. We'll come back to that later. If you want to learn more about KegTap, associated malware, and phishing campaigns, I highly encourage you to read this fantastic blog from some of our Mandiant teammates, Unhappy Hour Special, KegTap and Single Malt with a Ransomware Chaser. Now, because of the slight shift in TTPs, we initially created UNC 2352 to track the new wave of follow-on activity, but were eventually able to merge that back into UNC 1878. Beyond the core malware used, some of their other most notable TTPs include credential harvesting via the ntds.dit file. Note here on the right how they use the ntds util built-in to make that happen, and then using a multi-part archive to exfil. Next up is UNC 1878's preferred method of deploying ransomware. Iterating through hosts listed in text files on the share drive, they then leverage WMI and BitsAdmin to transfer and execute RYUK on each system in one fell swoop. And while we don't have enough time to cover all of them, UNC 1878 uses a wide range of tools to accomplish their mission, so I wanted to take a moment to recognize them here. Shifting from their TTPs to the bigger picture, we think UNC 1878 can best be summarized with two words: speed and scale. Why? Well, here's a couple stats to illustrate. Let's start with scale. In 2020, UNC 1878 was responsible for over 90% of intrusions we observe ending in RYUK. Note that I didn't say 100% of RYUK intrusions. We've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. RYUK and UNC 1878 are related, but not the same. While it's easy to make that assumption, there are many facets to a threat actor's identity, and it's important to consider all of them when attributing activity. To really drive this point home, consider that not every UNC 1878 intrusion ends in ransomware. In fact, most don't. Only 38% of UNC 1878 intrusions last year actually had evidence of RYUK. And what about speed? Those of you who saw our presentation in October might remember a term I called TTR, or time to ransomware. This is the time delta from when we first see UNC 1878 in an environment to when we first see ransomware in the environment. Based on the data available in October, UNC 1878's TTR was an impressive 5 days, 17 hours. Now it's even faster at a lower 4 days, 7 hours. And if you're still not satisfied, UNC 1878's new high score for fastest TTR is just 6 hours. Looking at a larger timeline, I've plotted here the UNC 1878 intrusions we've seen based on start date. Van created UNC 1878 almost a year ago to the day on January 29th. Though as we've learned more about this threat actor, we've been able to trace their activity as far back as May 2019. With the spike in intrusions at the beginning of 2020, Van and I released a blog in March discussing the origin of UNC 1878 and how we expanded that initial activity into a larger data set. Weirdly enough, it was also right around this time that UNC 1878 seemed to disappear altogether, as we had several months through spring and summer with no observed intrusions. And while it would have been awesome to say that we spooked them into retirement with our blog, we began to see RYUK make a strong comeback in the fall. As I mentioned on the last slide, to track this new activity, we created UNC 2352 in September, and then a month later, had enough confidence to merge it back into UNC 1878. The following week, we presented Spooky RYUKy on the Star webcast, but the scariest thing that happened that day was what came after. Reports began flooding in that RYUK was impacting numerous hospitals and organizations in the healthcare industry. In response, we released as many UNC 1878 indicators as we could, which you can still find on GitHub. And we weren't the only ones. As awful as these attacks were, it was really inspiring to see the way this community rallied together to share information and research on RYUK, UNC 1878, and related TTPs. And if that wasn't enough for October, it was also right around this time that Microsoft and reportedly US Cybercom took action to disrupt TrickBot and take down command and control infrastructure. And that's pretty much it. You're more or less all caught up now. Things have kind of gone quiet again since November, but as we know, that doesn't mean they're gone for good, and it doesn't mean our analysis stops either. Almost like archaeologists at a dig site, we've continued to learn more about UNC 1878 since last fall, and we're excited to share it with all of you. Which brings us to today, right now. So without further ado, let's get into it. Beacon Sashimi. I've titled this section Beacon Sashimi because I think it sounds better than Beacon Raw Fish. For those of you thinking to yourselves, hold on, sashimi isn't supposed to have rice. Yeah, you're right, but this is the best emoji we've got, and I'm willing to sacrifice accuracy for aesthetic. Anyways, this story starts, like all great phishing stories, with an email. Employee, I'm on my way to company office. That doesn't sound good. Please review your customer complaint request and, on and on and on. Okay, cool. We got a Google Drive link here. Now I know this seems pretty standard so far, but bear with me and let's see where it leads. So we've got this email, which contains a Google Drive link to a zip file, password protected with the date, November 13th. As the not so happy customer said in the email, this contains a complaint in the form of a PDF. Except, whoops, just kidding, it's not a complaint. And it's also JavaScript. Like really gross JavaScript too, way grosser than normal. We definitely don't have enough time to go through all the JavaScript, but rest assured it eventually runs some PowerShell, which looks like this. Decode that base64, and we can see it makes a GET request for the URL in red. So we're off to get this PHP, and fool me twice, it's PowerShell again. In fact, it's basically the exact same thing as before, just with a different URL. Except this time, we finally arrive at UNC1878 beacon. And even though the delivery method has changed, we find the same self-signed certificates on the C2 that we covered back in October. Which brings us to the question of why? Why all this hubbub all of a sudden, and what happened to KegTap? Now, this wasn't just a one-off. We saw the same technique used to target multiple customers across multiple phishing campaigns in November, indicating a real trend for UNC1878. Recall our timeline of UNC1878 intrusions. Focusing on initial access, UNC1878 used TrickBot initially, all the way up through March 2020 before their drop in activity. When we saw them reemerge in September, they had switched to KegTap. But unlike before, this new method of initial access has seemed short-lived. We began to see the raw beacon phishes in November, and we haven't seen UNC1878 use KegTap since. It was easier to rationalize the switch from TrickBot to KegTap because of the extended break. TrickBot has been around a long time, and it's common for threat actors to update their tool sets. But the quick pivot away from KegTap seems odd, especially with all of the success that they had in September and October. Then again, we also know that this is the exact time frame in which Microsoft, and though never officially acknowledged, US Cybercom took actions to disrupt and take down TrickBot. In one of Microsoft's blogs regarding their takedowns of TrickBot infrastructure, they talk about the impact they've observed. I love this quote where they say, "We and others have detected the TrickBot operators attempting to use a competing criminal syndicate to drop what were previously TrickBot payloads. And faced with its critical infrastructure under repeated attack, TrickBot operators are scrambling to find other ways to stay active." Now, it's unclear to us whether they're referring to KegTap or not, but we think the message is the same. Now, we don't have any answers here, and we're certainly not making any claims, but we think the timeline of events versus observed activity is worth calling out. Regardless of UNC1878's motives for switching their initial access, it's a reminder that these threat actors are quick, persistent, and financially motivated. They're here to make money, and when faced with enough friction, will adapt to ensure that cash flow continues. Van, back to you.
In our last presentation, we described UNC1878's penchant for offensive security frameworks, such as PowerShell Empire, Metasploit, and Cobalt Strike. We had seen some sort of offensive security tooling at every single UNC1878 intrusion. Since that presentation, we've observed UNC1878 using the Covenant C2 framework as well. For those unfamiliar, Covenant is a robust open source .NET C2 framework that provides full functionality for your offensive security tooling needs. During one UNC1878 IR, we identified a Covenant grunt stager after a KegTap beerbot infection, followed by interactive RYUK deployment. The C2 seen on screen here used the default Covenant C2 profile. Though this is a deviation from what UNC1878 typically uses, when assessing this against all UNC1878 intrusions we've seen, it's rare. In fact, taking a step away from UNC 1878 to look at all UNC groups we track that have used Covenant, we start to approach shiny Pokemon levels of rarity. With regards to UNC 1878, we currently don't have enough data to assess if Covenant usage is a trend for the group, or if they were just doing what we all secretly love to do, which is testing something new in production. So instead, let's focus on what we do know. And what we do know is that Cobalt Strike is still king, being seen in 89% of UNC 1878 intrusions we've observed over the last year and a half plus. So when it comes to UNC 1878's Covenant usage compared to their other preferred tools, in many ways, it really can be compared to a Covenant grunt, peppering you with their little plasma cannons. Essentially, there are bigger and badder things to focus on. I'd like to now introduce GRIMAGENT, which is a shiny new tool we've observed UNC 1878 using in their intrusions. GRIMAGENT is a backdoor that can execute commands, download and execute shellcode, and PE files all through randomly named scheduled tasks that are deleted after execution. The malware persists through the ever so elusive registry run key and through a randomly named scheduled task. Now, GRIMAGENT uses both asymmetric and symmetric encryption to encrypt various pieces of its C2 communication. For its initial beacon, GRIMAGENT will gather system information and use a hard-coded X509 public key to encrypt the data and append it to a random value as a hex string in an HTTP post request to the resource of 3 possible hard-coded C2 servers. GRIMAGENT will randomly pick from a set list of strings to populate various HTTP headers. On screen here is another beacon from the same sample that shows several different HTTP headers to the same C2. The backdoor will then use the same X509 public key to generate an AES session key, which it uses to decrypt subsequent responses from the C2 server as part of its main backdoor functionality. The samples we analyzed also contain Russian language graphical components in their resource section. On screen here, we can see a menu pop-up box with references to the agent project and agent version information. Here's an additional pop-up window we found. So there is code we identified that can interact with the pop-up boxes, but the functionality was not enabled in the samples we analyzed. One of the early easy pivots we did that led to more confirmed GRIMAGENT samples was simply searching for the resource hash of one of the dialog boxes seen on screen, which we recommend you do if you're interested in getting together a base set of samples to analyze. I'll now dive a bit into how we attributed GRIMAGENT usage to UNC 1878 in the cases we responded to. Looking at the timeline of GRIMAGENT, the earliest GRIMAGENT sample was seen on October 10th. At this time, we really didn't have a strong understanding of whether it was UNC 1878 tooling or potentially new malware, part of UNC 2053's ecosystem of initial access malware. The first time we identified GRIMAGENT in a customer environment was on October 19th, where our consultants were responding to a RYUK ransomware case that had the expected TTPs, specifically access provided via an UNC 2053 phishing campaign, followed by UNC 1878's interactive RYUK ransomware deployment. As we've mentioned before, and as detailed in our KegTap blog, we track a delineation between initial access and UNC 1878's follow-on activity. And due to this separation, we needed to be especially careful with how we approached attribution of GRIMAGENT at this client and going forward. On one of the domain controllers at this client, we identified GRIMAGENT within minutes of lateral movement and subsequent execution of a previously attributed UNC 1878 Cobalt Strike beacon sample. This built a strong case for attribution of GRIMAGENT to UNC 1878 for a couple of reasons. First, the timeline proximity between UNC 1878 and GRIMAGENT on the system was tight, within minutes. In addition, this activity was on a domain controller that UNC 1878 laterally moved to, and not on, say, a workstation clicking on a kegtap lure. Thus, the activity represented further stages in UNC 1878's intrusion lifecycle. UNC 1878 was bringing in the GRIMAGENT backdoor for subsequent access on the system. In half a dozen additional cases, we saw a similar scenario, GRIMAGENT being executed shortly after UNC 1878 beacon, oftentimes on systems that UNC 1878 laterally moved to. As I had just detailed, we had strong evidence to support attribution of GRIMAGENT usage to UNC 1878 across these multiple intrusions, but we continue to take caution in the attribution for a couple of reasons. First, we had seen several GRIMAGENT samples code signed with a certificate that looked similar to UNC 1878's previous code signing certs. From our first presentation, we discussed how we had seen the same code signing certificates used by UNC 1878 to sign different malware, including a cert overlaps between UNC 1878 beacon samples and UNC 2053's kegtap loader, which again is used for initial access. One of the examples from our first presentation can be seen here on the right. While we haven't seen GRIMAGENT certificates being used to sign any different malware yet, the certificate reuse is one of the several factors that suggest some sort of relationship between UNC 1878 and UNC 2053 tooling. And thus we need to be especially careful with how we assess the samples from an attribution standpoint. Next, while we were pivoting around to identify additional GRIMAGENT samples, we found a sample uploaded via VirusTotal with a file name containing report review that should look very familiar to anyone who has tracked UNC 2053's phishing campaigns. When we initially saw this, we found it peculiar since all GRIMAGENT we've seen to date was after the initial phish and oftentimes after UNC 1878 had already established a foothold and began moving around. We were able to correlate an UNC 2053 single malt campaign from that day. And so looking at the GRIMAGENT file name again, one theory we have is that the GRIMAGENT sample could have been the second payload immediately after an initial phish, but that wasn't something that we were able to validate with our telemetry. What we do know is that to date, we have not seen GRIMAGENT used directly as part of UNC 2053's access phishing campaigns. But some of these loose overlaps I've detailed between UNC 1878 and UNC 2053 illustrate the importance of handling tooling attribution on a case-by-case basis backed by primary source data. I'll now turn it back over to Aaron to discuss one other important finding and wrap things up.
Thanks, Van. Real quick, because I heard some people might be getting a robot voice from me, I just turned my video off, and if that happens again, definitely let me know. Okay, so, oh snap, that's right. We can now say that we've observed UNC 1878 deploy Conti. So to start, I'd like to go over some of the data points we used for attribution. First, we've got the same file path used for both Conti and RYUK. We also observed credential harvesting via the ntds.dit file, which, as we know, is an UNC 1878 staple. Not only that, but they continue to use the perflogs1 directory as well. Next, we have copy.bat, which, as the name suggests, is used to copy ransomware to other hosts. Everything from psexec to the use of the share drive and comps.txt files is practically identical. And if that wasn't enough, there's also the follow-up exe.bat, which is used to execute the just copied ransomware. Now, before we get too excited, it's important to note that so far, we've only seen UNC 1878 deploy Conti once. Similar to the use of Covenant, it's not enough for us to say that this is a shift so much as it is an anomaly. We've also seen other intrusions involving Conti that we don't attribute to UNC 1878. Just like with RYUK, we have to separate the malware from the threat actor. And lastly, Conti wasn't the only thing out of the norm for UNC 1878 here. There was also data theft and subsequent extortion. Again, this is the only time we've seen this from UNC 1878, so while we're not willing to say it's a new trend for them, we can't rule out the possibility that it will happen again in the future. On advanced practices, we believe the best things come in threes. So as we reflect on everything we've shared with you today, there are three big takeaways we want to leave you with. First, speed and scale. We hope by now that we've said this enough times for it to stick. UNC 1878 continues to be a dominant player in the ransomware game, and their operational tempo only appears to be getting faster. Like Chris Krebs said this morning, regardless of what your business does, ransomware is in your threat model. Are you prepared to stop UNC 1878 in a little over 4 days or 6 hours? Next is evolution. Over time, threat actors change and adapt. We've highlighted a number of changes today for UNC 1878, and while it's not always clear if these are short or long-term, it's important to stay on top of them so that we can continue to track and defend against this group. And last but not least is nuance. Operations, especially in the cybercrime world, have nuance. Relationships between various ecosystems like KegTac, TrickBot, and RYUK can make attribution difficult in terms of who's behind the keyboard. As such, the items we've presented today that have posed attribution difficulties such as GRIMAGENT further emphasizes the importance of a data-driven approach to technical attribution. It's not easy, but being able to say what activity you're not certain about is equally as important as what you're confident in attributing. Thank you for watching Spooky RYUKy Chapter 2-ky, and thank you to SANS CTI for having us on. We'll be in our hallway chat on Slack if you'd like to talk. Otherwise, you can reach us by email or Twitter. Thank you.